What would you do if the only thing standing between you and a winter street was a dead woman's tools and a building no one had touched in 20 years? What if the last thing your teacher ever gave you wasn't advice or money or a name to call on, but a set of iron keys to a place the whole town had already decided was beyond saving? They said Rowan Ashby was foolish for even trying. A girl of 22 with ink-stained hands and a leather satchel full of bookbinding tools, walking up to a collapsed workshop on the edge of Dunmore like she owned the place. Well, she did own it technically. That was the problem. Pull up a chair and settle in for a while. And let us know in the comments where you're joining us from tonight, as we tell the story of Rowan Ashby and the forgotten bindery on Grey Whistle Lane. Rowan had grown up in the back rooms of other people's buildings. She had slept in the storage loft of Edith Callow's print shop for 3 years before Edith died, and in the months after, she had slept in the same loft while Edith's nephew argued about the estate. She was not a tenant, the nephew said. She was not family. She was, in his words, a stray the old woman had taken a shine to. He said it to her face, standing in the doorway of the print shop with his hands in his pockets. Not even enough of a man to be cruel behind her back. She had been 16 when Edith Callow first put a bone folder in her hand and said, quietly, as if it were not a tremendous thing at all, "This is how you make something that lasts." The old woman had been a bookbinder before she turned to printing, and she had carried those two worlds in her hands, without ever seeming to strain under the weight of them. She smelled of linseed oil and paper sizing, and in the evenings of the cedar shavings she kept in a small box by her chair to keep the moths away. She was not a warm woman by nature. She did not hug. She did not say she was proud. But she showed Rowan every technique she knew, and that, Rowan came to understand, was a kind of love that outlasted sentiment. When Edith Callow's estate was finally settled, Rowan received 2 things: the set of bookbinding tools Edith had used since before Rowan was born, a worn leather roll containing bone folders, an awl, a finishing palette, and a small-handled paring knife with a blade worn thin from 30 years of use, and a deed of property to a place called the Callow Bindery on Grey Whistle Lane, in the town of Dunmore, British Columbia, which had been closed for 19 years, and which no one, apparently, had wanted badly enough to fight over. The nephew, whose name was Gerald Foss, had looked at the deed with thinly veiled contempt when the solicitor read it aloud. He'd gone out to see the building once, by his own account, and described it as not worth the cost of tearing down. He was a practical man. He took the printing equipment, the good furniture, and the savings account. He left Rowan the tools and the wreck. She had never seen the bindery. Edith had mentioned it rarely, a place she'd operated in her early years, before she moved to the larger shop on the main street. She said once that she'd closed it after a flood damaged the lower floor, and that she'd meant to fix it up again someday, but someday had a way of staying out of reach. That was all. No stories of it, no photographs, just the mention and then silence, and then the keys arriving in an envelope after her death. Rowan stood outside the building on a gray October morning, with the leather tool roll under her arm, and the kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. She had been staying with a friend for 6 weeks since the print shop changed hands, and the welcome had worn to something polite and careful, the way welcome does. She needed to go somewhere. This was the only somewhere she had. Grey Whistle Lane ran behind the main street, a narrow service road that the town had more or less forgotten about. 2 of the 3 businesses that had once operated there were long closed. The third, a small locksmith, had shuttered in the spring. The bindery sat at the end of the lane, its face turned slightly away from the road, as if embarrassed by its own condition. It had been a beautiful building once. You could still see that. The front was riverstone masonry, dark and dense, with deep-set windows that had kept their shape even while their frames had rotted. The door was off its upper hinge, leaning at an angle that made it impossible to close. A vine she couldn't name had grown across the left side of the facade and then died, leaving a brittle black lattice, pressed against the stone like the bones of something. The hand-lettered sign above the door, which had once read Callow and Sons Fine Bookbinding, had faded to pale ghosts of letters that you could only read if you already knew what they said. An older man came out of the locksmith's shuttered building as she was standing there. He was carrying a box of hardware and paused when he saw her. "Thought that place might get someone eventually," he said. Not unfriendly, but not warm either, the flat assessment of a man who has watched a lot of things go wrong. "It belonged to my teacher," Rowan said. He set the box down. "Edith Callow. You must be the girl she talked about." He looked her over in the way people do when they're measuring what they were told against what they see. "She always said she'd send someone down here to set it right." He reached out a hand. Wendell Sproat. I ran the locksmiths. Rowan Ashby. You a bookbinder? Yes. He glanced at the building and then back at her. You know the bottom floor flooded about 20 years ago. There's rot in the subfloor, and I'd guess half the joists need replacing. The roof held, mostly. There's broken glass in the back room. He paused. The upstairs is dry. Edith used to sleep up there sometimes when she worked late. I don't know what state it's in. I'll find out, Rowan said. He picked up his box. You got a place to stay in the meantime? She looked at the building. He followed her gaze and said nothing for a moment. Then, the town's going to have opinions about this. They usually do, she said. He gave a short sound that was almost a laugh and carried his box to his truck. She used Edith's key to let herself in through the leaning door. The ground floor was everything Wendell Sproat had suggested, and a few things he hadn't. The flood damage was old and settled into the bones of the place. The subfloor had buckled along the north wall, pushing up the flagstones there into a rough ridge, and the smell was of damp wood that had dried and then gotten wet again over many years, a smell like old basements and forgotten corners. The bindery equipment that had been left behind was sheeted under canvas that had partially collapsed. She lifted one corner and found a nipping press, cast iron, crusted with rust at the joints. Beside it, a finishing stove, cracked through the body, a paper cutter with a seized blade, the things that hadn't been worth taking 19 years ago. Against the far wall, stacked in a tidy column that seemed out of place in all the disorder, were perhaps 40 finished books. Cloth-bound, some leather. She pulled one out carefully. It was a journal, blank inside, sewn with red thread through a spine that had held its shape perfectly. She opened the cover and found a small label in Edith's handwriting. Sample binding, February 1987. Coptic stitch, linen thread, goatskin spine. The books had been waiting here for 19 years, perfectly made and completely forgotten, in a room that was falling apart around them. She held one for a long time. Then she climbed the stairs. The upstairs was dry, as Wendell had said. It was a single room running the width of the building, with low windows facing the lane and a small iron stove in the corner that looked functional. A narrow bed frame was pushed against one wall, no mattress. A workbench ran below the windows, wide and solid, the kind of surface a craftsperson builds once and builds right. Edith's. Rowan ran a hand along it and felt the shallow grooves left by decades of work, paring cuts, creasing marks, the ghost impressions of things made and finished and sent away. She didn't go back to her friend's house that night. She swept the upstairs floor, dragged up a drop cloth to use as bedding, lit the iron stove with wood she found stacked in the small yard behind the building, and lay down on the cold floor in her coat. Outside, the October wind came off the mountains and pressed against the stone walls. She was here. She didn't know yet if that was a beginning or a final door closing behind her, but the building was solid under her, and the stove was warm, and somewhere in the quiet she could feel the shape of the problem. Not whether to try, but where to start. In the morning she found out what the town thought about it. She had gone to the hardware store on the main street for a box of nails and a tube of wood adhesive. Starting points, not solutions, but starting points were what she had. The man at the counter, whose name badge said Rupert Gale, looked at her shopping list and then at her. You buying for the Callow building? He asked. Yes. He pulled the items without saying anything more, but she felt the look he exchanged with the woman at the end of the counter. The look that towns give to people they've already decided about. She was paying when a man came through the door with the particular energy of someone who takes up more space than he occupies. He was in his 50s, well-dressed for a small town, with the easy confidence of a person accustomed to being heard. His name, she would learn, was Douglas Finch, and he owned the commercial property on the main street and several buildings on the side roads. He had, Wendell Sproat would tell her later, made an offer on the Grey Whistle properties a year ago, when Edith's estate was still being settled. He looked at her with interest and without warmth. You must be the one who ended up with the Callow place, he said. That's right. I offered $8,000 for that building, he said, not quietly. The whole lane, actually. Clean it up, put in something useful. He tilted his head slightly. They tell me it went to a girl, a bookbinder. The pause before bookbinder was precisely calibrated to suggest that this was not a serious occupation. You know the floor needs to be completely redone. I know. And the electrical's not up to code. Probably never will be without a major investment. I appreciate the information, Rowan said. My offer's still open, Douglas Finch said. $8,000. You could walk away from this cleanly, find yourself a nice apartment, not spend the next year fighting that building. He smiled in the way of someone who considers himself generous. I'd give you until spring to think it over. She took her bag from Rupert Gale and looked at Douglas Finch with the particular expression of a person who has been underestimated for long enough that it no longer even stings, it just clarifies. I'll keep that in mind, she said, and went out. On the sidewalk she stood for a moment in the cold morning air. Her hands were tight around the bag. There was a feeling in her chest that she recognized. The desire to justify herself, to explain, to make them see. She let it pass. Edith Callow had never once explained herself to anyone who had already decided not to understand, and it had not diminished her. Rowan went back to the bindery. She started, as she had the night before, with what was possible. The upstairs first. Clean the workbench, test the stove, establish a working space and a sleeping space, make the room habitable by degrees. She spent 3 days on it, scrubbing, sorting, hauling down what couldn't be salvaged, making an inventory of what Edith had left. A surprising amount of it was still good. Bookbinding materials preserved well. The bone folders were fine. The thread was dry and strong. There were bottles of paste and size that had sealed perfectly, tins of gold leaf dust that had not oxidized. Edith's tools, combined with the ones she'd carried in her own leather roll, gave her a modest but complete set. She set up the finishing palette by the window and ran her thumb over its surface to check the heat distribution the way Edith had taught her. The old stove would need a proper test, but she thought it would hold. On the 4th day, she started on the ground floor. The subfloor was worse than she had hoped and better than she had feared. The section along the north wall was genuinely rotten. She probed it with a screwdriver in half a dozen places and got soft resistance every time, the wood punky and useless. But the rest of the floor, though uneven, had dried hard. The joists beneath the sound section were solid fir, old growth, the kind of timber they didn't mill anymore. She could work around the bad section, box it in, rebuild it later. For now, she pulled up the worst of the buckled flagstones, dug out the rotted wood underneath, and packed the cavity with gravel and a layer of lime mortar she mixed in a bucket in the yard. It wasn't a proper repair. She knew that, but it was a floor, and a floor was what she needed. Her hands, already calloused from years at the binding bench, became something else entirely over those weeks. The blisters hardened. Her shoulders changed shape. She ate soup from a pot on the iron stove and fell asleep early, and woke up before light and went back to work. The cold crept under the door, and she stuffed the gap with a strip of wool blanket. Wendell Sproat appeared one afternoon with a second-hand propane heater and left it without knocking, which was the best kind of gift. She found the cache on a Tuesday. She had been working her way along the workbench, pulling out the lower drawers to check them for damp, when the third drawer from the left refused to come all the way out. She pulled harder and heard the soft clunk of something inside rolling forward. She worked the drawer free and reached to the back, and her hand found a glass bottle stoppered with a cork, containing a dark brown liquid. She set it on the bench. Behind it was another bottle, and then another, and then a flat tin, sealed with tape that had dried to brittleness. And behind the tin, a cloth-wrapped parcel tied with waxed cord. She sat down. There were 7 bottles in total, each stoppered and sealed with wax around the cork. She lifted one to the window and turned it in the light. The liquid inside was amber and clear, and clinging to the inside of the glass, something crystallized. A residue of mineral content, she thought, catching at the light in small bright points. She unstoppered the one with the most faded label and brought it carefully to her nose. It smelled like nothing she could name immediately, and then, a moment later, like something she could. The scent of oak and iron and something older underneath, a faint sweet dryness that she associated, without quite knowing why, with old cathedrals and wood kept dry for centuries. Iron gall ink, she thought, hand-mixed. The flat tin contained labels handwritten in Edith's small, precise script. She unfolded one. Galatanic, 1988. Oak galls sourced locally, Okanagan Valley. Ferrous sulfate precipitate, 3-year cure, for restoration use only. She opened the cloth parcel. Inside was a notebook, not bound in the style of the finished journals downstairs, but sewn simply in a soft gray cover, the kind a person makes for themselves without ceremony. The first page read, Edith Nora Callow. Ink formulations, paper treatments, adhesive recipes, private record. Below that, a note in smaller letters. If you're reading this and I'm not there to explain it, you already know enough to understand why these matter. Follow the instructions exactly. Rowan sat at the workbench for a long time with the notebook open. Edith Callow, it turned out, had spent the years between closing the bindery and reopening the print shop, developing something she had never, as far as Rowan knew, told anyone about. The notebook was 46 pages of dense handwritten notes on the formulation of archival-grade iron gall inks and adhesives, the kind used for the restoration of historical documents, old maps, damaged manuscripts, the kind that art conservators and archivists paid specialists to produce. The callow formula, as Edith referred to it in the notes, used a specific combination of oak galls from trees in the Okanagan Valley, with a mineral content she had tested over years against standard formulations and found measurably superior. The resulting ink was exceptionally stable. It did not brown, it did not bleed, and it resisted both moisture and UV degradation better than commercial alternatives. The notebook included test results, compared against 3 institutional formulas. It included correspondence, tucked as loose pages, from a conservator at the Vancouver Museum who had tested samples and written that she had, in 15 years of work, not seen results like it from a non-industrial source. Rowan set the letter down. She looked at the 7 sealed bottles, enough ink to begin demonstrating the formula. She looked at the notebook, 46 pages of a dead woman's most careful work. She looked out the window at Grey Whistle Lane, and beyond it at the gray October sky. Edith had left her the building, the tools, the knowledge, and now this, the thing she had been building quietly for years without telling anyone, stored in the back of a drawer to wait for someone who could carry it forward. It was not a ruin. It was a laboratory, and Rowan, without having known it until this moment, had been trained to understand it. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the most alive she had ever felt. The weather came down off the mountains, with serious intent in November. The kind of cold that made the old stone walls of the bindery tick and settle. The kind of wind that found every gap you hadn't sealed yet. Rowan worked in layers, stopping every hour to reheat her hands at the propane heater, going back to work. She was rebuilding the ground floor workspace while simultaneously learning, from Edith's notebook, the chemistry she had never been taught aloud. She made her first test batch of ink from Edith's formula on a gray afternoon in mid-November. She followed the instructions with the concentration she had learned at the binding bench. Precision mattered here, the same way the depth of a paring cut mattered, the same way thread tension mattered in a Coptic stitch. The result, after the settling time Edith specified, was a bottle of ink so dark it looked almost purple in the bottle and pure black on the page. She tested it on scraps of paper she found downstairs. She tested its resistance to water. She waited 24 hours and tested again. It behaved exactly as Edith's notes said it would. She wrote a letter to the Vancouver Museum conservator, whose name appeared in Edith's correspondence. She explained who she was and what she had found. She enclosed a small sample of the ink on a prepared paper strip, as Edith's notes specified. She said she was not sure yet what she was building, but that she was building it, and that she thought the work should be known. She did not expect a quick reply. She went back to work on the floor. The crisis came in the first week of December. On an evening when the temperature dropped sharply, and the wind began to sound less like weather and more like something with an intention. Rowan had banked the stove and was upstairs when she heard the noise. Not from outside, but from within the building, a low creak followed by a sharp crack from the north wall of the ground floor. She went down with the lantern. The section of subfloor she had shored up with gravel and mortar had held, but the cold had worked on the old stone footing underneath it over the past weeks, and something had shifted. A crack had opened in the mortar at the base of the north wall, a thin line she could slide 2 fingers into. She felt cold air coming through it from outside. The wall itself was not moving. The river stone masonry was too deep and too solid for that. But the footing was settling, and settling foundations had a way of becoming serious problems without announcement. She had no money for a mason. She had almost no money left at all. She stood in the dark ground floor with the lantern, and the cold coming in through the crack, and thought about Douglas Finch's offer. $8,000. An apartment somewhere warm. Not this. This was the kind of problem that swallowed people. This was the kind of problem that made practical men right. She did not think about that for very long. In the morning, she went to find Wendell Sproat. He was at a storage unit on the edge of town, sorting the last of his shop inventory. She explained the problem with the footing as clearly as she could. He listened without interrupting, which she was coming to understand was his way. "There's a man named Clifton Hare who does heritage masonry," he said when she finished. "Works on old stone buildings, churches, the older homesteads. He's retired now, but he's not the type who stops working. He might take a look." He paused. "He owes me a favor, actually. I can't pay much," Rowan said. "Let me talk to him," Wendell said. Clifton Hare arrived 2 days later. He was a man who appeared to have been constructed from the same material he worked with. Dense, unhurried, with hands like root systems and eyes that took in the wall and its crack without alarm. The way someone looks at a problem they have already begun solving. He spent an hour examining the footing, going outside to check the foundation line, coming back in to probe the mortar with a pick. Thermal movement, he said finally. The old lime mortar's flexible enough, but the footing's been losing ground for years. Probably started after the flood, when the drainage around the building changed. He crouched and pointed. Here and here. I can repoint the footing with hydraulic lime, pack the voids, arrest the movement. He stood. It's not an emergency yet, but you want it done before spring thaw. How much? Rowan asked. He named a number that was less than she expected and still more than she had. He saw it in her face. I can start in January, he said. You'll have it by then. She hoped that was true. She sold 2 of Edith's finished journals from the ground floor stack to an antique shop on the main street. The shop owner recognized the quality immediately and offered a fair price. She sold a 3rd online, which required borrowing Wendell's address for the shipping. It was not enough, but it was movement. The letter from the Vancouver Museum came in mid-December. The conservator's name was Dr. Annette Chow, and she wrote carefully, in the professional language of someone accustomed to measuring her words. She confirmed that the sample Rowan had sent was consistent with the properties described in Edith Callow's earlier correspondence, which she had kept on for years, in the hope that the source formula would surface again. She wrote that her department had been looking for a reliable supplier of archival-grade iron gall ink for their collection treatment program. She wrote that she would like to schedule a call. Rowan read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down on the floor of the workbench room and put her hands over her face. It was not relief exactly. It was the feeling of a shape becoming clear, the shape of what the building was for, what the tools were for, what the years of being taught quietly and precisely by a woman who never explained her reasons had been building toward. The call with Dr. Annette Chow lasted an hour. The conservator asked careful questions about the formula, the sourcing of the oak galls, the curing process. Rowan answered from Edith's notebook, which she had read until she knew it almost by memory. At the end, Dr. Chow said that the museum would like to trial a small order, 12 bottles, restoration grade, with a view to a supply agreement if the results matched the sample. 12 bottles was more than Rowan had. She would need time and materials and the use of a proper work surface. But she had a workbench, and she had Edith's instructions, and she had the formula. I can have them by February, she said. She paid Clifton Hare in January, as she had hoped. He came with 2 younger men and spent 4 days on the footing, working with the quiet focus of craftspeople who take structural integrity personally. When they finished, the crack in the north wall was sealed with fresh lime mortar, pale against the old stone, and the footing was solid. Clifton Hare ran a hand along the repaired section before he left and said, simply, she'll stand. It was the finest thing anyone had said to Rowan all winter. Word moved through Dunmore the way it does in small towns, without clear mechanism, but with impressive efficiency. The story that traveled was not quite accurate and not entirely wrong. That the Callow girl had brought the old bindery back, that she was making some kind of specialty ink, that a museum in Vancouver was involved. People looked at the building differently when they passed it. The vine skeletons on the left side of the facade, which Rowan had left because she liked the way they traced the stone, seemed to become a feature rather than a failure. Douglas Finch passed her on the main street one afternoon in February. He did not stop, but he nodded, the precise nod of a man acknowledging that his assessment had been wrong without saying so. It was, she thought, the closest he was likely to come. The 12 bottles for the Vancouver Museum went out on a Tuesday in February. Packed in a wooden crate Wendell Sproat helped her build. Each bottle nested in sawdust and sealed with new wax, each carrying a small label in the same format as Edith's originals, because some things should not be changed. She had added 1 line to the label, Callow Bindery, Dunmore, BC. 2 weeks later, Dr. Annette Chow called again. The samples had exceeded the expected parameters on 3 of 5 stability tests. She wanted to discuss a formal supply arrangement. She also mentioned carefully that a colleague at the National Archives had asked about the source. Spring came to Dunmore softly that year, the way it comes to mountain towns when winter decides to leave without a fight. The lane behind the main street, which had been a gray and forgotten corridor through the cold months, caught the light differently once the angle of the sun changed. The stone facade of the bindery warmed to a dark honey color in the afternoon, and the twisted vine skeletons began. Around the 3rd week of March, to show the first pale suggestion of green. Rowan opened the ground floor to the public on the first Saturday of April, just for the morning. It was not a grand opening. She had no money for signs or advertising. She put a card in the window of the Main Street coffee shop. Callow Bindery, Grey Whistle Lane, open Saturday mornings, bookbinding demonstrations, custom work, archival supplies. She opened the leaning door, which now hung properly on both hinges, and let in the light. 7 people came that first morning. 2 of them were curious and left after 5 minutes. The others stayed. A woman who restored old documents for a historical society in Kelowna asked about the iron gall ink. A retired teacher wanted to know how a book was sewn. An older man stood in front of the nipping press, which Rowan had cleaned and oiled and returned to working order, and said that his grandfather had had one like it. Rowan showed him how it worked. She stood in the lane at the end of the morning with her hands in her apron pockets and looked at the building. The stone was warm from the sun. The door was solid. Inside, on the low shelves along the east wall, the remaining journals from Edith's original stack were arranged in a line. Beside them, the first small inventory of new work. Journals sewn with linen thread, notebooks in soft leather covers, sample cards of archival ink. Wendell Sproat came by in the afternoon, as he sometimes did, and leaned against the doorframe looking in. "She would have liked to see this," he said. "I know," Rowan said. "What are you calling the ink line?" Rowan had thought about this. "Callow formula," she said. "It's what she called it in the notebook." Wendell nodded. He looked at the wall, where Rowan had found the drawer with the bottles, and then at the bottles arranged on the shelf above the workbench, the new ones she had prepared, alongside the 3 remaining originals she kept sealed. "She always said she'd left things in order," he said. "I never knew what she meant." "She meant this," Rowan said. She had not built anything, really. Not in the way Douglas Finch built things, with capital and calculation and an eye on the return. She had cleared a floor and sealed a crack and read a dead woman's notebook until the handwriting felt like a spoken voice. She had made ink from a formula preserved in a back drawer for 19 years, waiting for hands that knew what to do with it. The valley below Dunmore would not name the lane after her. The town would not put up a sign. But the people who needed what she made knew where to find it. Down the service road, behind the main street, past the shuttered locksmith, to the building with the riverstone face and the vine-covered left side, and the door that finally, this spring, hung straight. Inside, there was always the smell of oak galls and linen thread and warm iron, and the sound of work being done with patience, and on the shelf by the window, a leather-bound notebook in a gray cover that Rowan opened every morning before she started. She never thought of herself as having saved the place. She thought of it the way she thought of everything Edith Callow had ever taught her. That understanding something, really understanding it, means knowing what it already is. Not making it into something new. Just learning to see what was always there.